So hi, yes, verbosity may be the key to better code. This may sound very counterintuitive for most people, but let's dig in. So before we start, a bit about me. My name is Nia, not Naya. That's all right, I get that all the time. I used to live in Atlanta. That's where I actually started out as a developer. And now I live in Toronto. In fact, I live at that exact intersection that's on the picture there. And I work for an American company based out of New York called Healthy, and they do health administration sort of platform. So if you're in the US and you are worried about your health information, we're one of the many platforms that support doctors and patients to talk about booking appointments, where your patient data lives, and all that fun stuff. And yes, I am a serious coffee addict. We can chat about coffee afterwards. So my role at Healthy is I'm a tech lead. I run the front-end platform team. So a lot of what we do is figuring out the overall architecture for the front end. And we work in React and TypeScript. So before we jump into verbosity and how that may be a better approach, let's actually look at the dry code principle that most of you may be familiar with. What it actually stands for is don't repeat yourself, right? The whole concept here is to promote code reusability, make components that we can reuse, make developers go faster, make the dev experience easier to build features better, right? So let's actually look at a code sample of that. Here we have the section that's repeating with the header and the main content and the button. And you can see, I've repeated myself a gazillion times here. And if we have more sections, it'll be more repetition, and it's a pain in the ass. Hence why you have dry code, right? Where we can now make it into a nice little array, and then it actually spits out this wonderful component that goes over the same information, and we're not repeating that component anymore. All that information is being auto-generated, right? Again, most of the code samples here are React-based. So for any Angular people out there, I am sorry. Now, verbosity here, let's actually look at what the word means. It's the quality of using more words than needed. And I want to sneak in the concept of being concise. That's giving a lot of information clearly and in a few words. Brief but comprehensive, right? So with the dry code principles, we get into this pattern of writing abstracted versions of code. We move away components into these reusable components. And then long-term, we suffer some consequences because there are these abstract components we just automatically use without fully understanding what's happening in there, right? And we forget that we're writing code for other developers to read. The concept of verbosity here is to promote writing code for readability, for other developers to be able to read and debug. So let's dig into that a little bit. I have this beautiful UI here. This is an accounting firm. They've got a wonderful calendar where you can book meetings, right? So we're just going to actually walk through a product business logic thing and how those components are built out here. So they've got the beautiful calendar, and the thing we're actually focusing on is when they click on it, they want to be able to book a meeting. So the book a meeting form, right? That form is what we're trying to go build. New product, there's nothing out there. We're going to actually build out that form. I am not doing live coding, because that seems insane for this right now, so it's already pre-built-ish. So here, I'm using React Final Forms to help me with form handling for errors and all that beautiful state management stuff. Go read about React Final Form online, great library. But here, for this use case, what it does let me do is set a form, pass in an on-submit, like what happens when you click the button on submit, and then build out my fields, right? So I've got the client field for the client ID where they can select a client. That's basically this little select right here. And then we've got, using React Date Picker, the date object. Basically, we can select the date for it. Similarly, a start time and an end time. And then we're doing meeting type, right? So we have different types of meeting, initial meetings or tax overview meetings. So they can have that kind of meeting type. And then the meeting format, whether it's Zoom or Google Meet or in person. And then finally, we've got our notes text area right here. And then we've got the submit. Great, the form is built. Let's actually pass some data into it, or the submit function for it, right? So on submit, it's basically going to post that information to this REST API that does not exist, so don't try to click on that. And it's going to pass in the values from the form. And great, we now have a meeting, right? We also have some fancy error handling there. All beautiful, wonderful. So now the component looks pretty concise, pretty neat, pretty amazing. Awesome. What's next? Well, there's some things here that I'm kind of hiding, because for my own sanity while writing this talk, I kind of pre-set up clients and meeting types and meeting formats to come in from the parent or wherever, the magical place this code lives in, right? So, and I'm expecting them to give me meeting IDs, or like for the client, it's going to have a client ID and a client name. For the meeting types, it's going to have a meeting ID and the meeting name, right? Type name. And I'm assuming those things exist. In reality, for this component, the first time you're building it, what you're actually going to do is fetch all that information within this component. Now, for the sake of keeping this talk fairly short, and because I was too lazy to keep writing all that code, I just did the props, right? So this is what the objects I'm expecting, the array of objects that I'm expecting for that is. So this is a bit TypeScript-y syntax. Hopefully, this makes sense what I'm talking about here. So ID is like unique value, label could be anything, or name could be anything, and we're expecting a string for it. And there could be other information in there. But for our use case, this is all what we care about. Moving forward, the form is out there. People are booking the meetings. You're making a lot of money. The accountants are happy. What happens? Well, product has more requirements. They want now a user client list view where there's a list of all the clients the accountants can have, and they also want to create a dashboard for the clients to be able to book the meetings, right? So now the idea here is we want to allow the accountants to book meetings from clicking the book meeting form button here, or allow the clients to book meetings with their accountant either from their client dashboard here or from the calendar view for the client. Cool. You already have the book meeting component we can use for the accountants. And on the client side, the only real difference is that clients get to select the accountant versus the accountants get to select the clients. Similar looking form, same component. The logic seems to be fairly simple, because at the end of it all, what is it doing? It's booking a meeting. It's a form that's rendering some stuff, right? Cool. Dry code principles, we can use that. This is some of the product requirements now based on where the form pops up, right? So again, the form is in a modal, and then we're not handling the modal logic right now. But the idea here is we've got each of the views for the user calendar, the user client list, the client dashboard, and the client calendar view. They have specific requirements. Seems quite reasonable. So let's look at the user calendar. Basically, the idea is when you click on the little section there, it should pop up that form and pre-fill the date and start time based on which section they clicked on, right? And on submission, the form should also say which accountant made that client meeting. Reasonable? So we've made some changes to our meeting form component right here. We've added some new initial values props and a current user, so it knows which the current user is. We've updated our values going into the post call to now say account ID is a current user.id, right? And the initial values we're expecting is something like this, where there'll be date, start time, end time, pre-filled with some sort of date object based on where they clicked, and then all the rest of it is still null. Cool. Not too hard, very easy, still reasonable to look at. We also now need to update our date picker, the start, end time, and the date object, right? So now there's a selected value for it, where it says, if there's initial values dot date, use that. If that's null, then send in a new date object, just pre-filling for React date picker, right? Same thing for all of that. So not too complicated, super easy. Let's move on to the next place we have to use that form, the client list. Cool, we already have a current user ID going in, so we know which accountant it is, but the slight difference here is there is no date and start time, but the client should be pre-selected for that form. Because hey, if you're clicking on this row, of course you're expecting to book a meeting with that client, right? Not too hard. So again, at this point, the little change for the initial bits here is not that different. The really big change here is the client ID. They're now no longer passing in date, start time, or end time, but we're passing in client ID. So now the form is expecting client ID to be filled in. Everything else stays the same. Great. We've got the user accountant view all set up, and that component is still happy. So let's move into the client dashboard view. Here, the date and start time should not be pre-filled. Easy peasy. We've already done that. On submission, we should save the form information and the client who booked the meeting. So it's no longer saving the accountant who booked the meeting, it's saving the client who booked the meeting. So in this case, our current user is very different. They're no longer the accountant, they're the accountant's clients, right? So here, they click the book meeting button. We now need to give them a list of accountants they can book, like select from for that select field. And we also need to kind of tell our form fields here, is it a client view or an accountant view, right? Because based on if it is a client view or an accountant view, we need to change that select option where they get to pick either clients or accountants. So in the case of a client view, they should be able to select the accountant. In the case of the accountant's view, they should be able to select the clients. So there, we have a quick Boolean, very easy, based on whether it's true or false, it'll show up what it needs said. Same thing here for the submit function, we made some changes as well. Based on whether the current user is the client or not, we're passing in different props, like different values to the client ID versus the accountant ID. So this is just giving a little bit more closer in-depth look at that. And again, the initial values is null in this area because we're in the dashboard view. Amazing. At this point, I'm hoping I haven't lost all of you, because this took me a little bit of time to like follow the logic. And this is what the API now looks, that actual submit function. There's a difference there, because based on if it's a client or whether it's the accountant, we may have different endpoints we want to hit for that path on creating a new meeting, right? OK, so there's a little extra complexity there. At this point, that form is looking a little painful to read, but not too bad. Ooh, we've got one more area, client calendar. So in this case, we've already built out what the client side should look like. We just need to pre-fill the date and start time, right? Not too bad. Same concept as the last time, but again, date, start time, and end time is pre-filled. Everything else is null. Cool. At this stage, the current meeting form no longer fits in one single slide for me. So now I've got this larger current meeting form where all the logic for the on-submit and all of that lives here, and then a separate slide to show the larger field components. At this stage, to caveat my examples here, I'm still not handling the logic of the modal opening or closing. I am still not conveniently handling the logic of fetching any of this information. I'm just assuming it's all there magically for my component because I am too lazy to write that code, right? In the world of reality, for most of your cases, you're probably doing all of that in this one component, starting out. Because, hey, why would you repeat that code, right? Dry code principles. And just when you think we're done, there's more. Because what's the next logical step? Edit and delete. For the sake of keeping this concise, we're going to stick with just edit, because delete and everything else that comes after that is another pain in the ass. So for the user calendar, they should be able to click on an existing item and then pre-fill the form with the existing meeting information, be able to edit it, and then save, right? Same thing with the dashboard for the client side and the calendar for the client side. Cool. Let's make the updates. So now we need to separate out the create and the edit meeting calls, the post calls. So we've got two different sets here, where if it's, for the create, we're doing the same kind of concept, where if it's a client view versus the accountant view, we're doing the updated values based on that, and doing the post call for the edit based on what the path is. Same concept here. Yeah. And here, for the edit side, you can see we're also passing in an ID, like a meeting ID, at which point, from the component, the meeting ID is being passed in as part of the initial values, right? So the actual submit function looks something like this. And now that overall large meeting form component is also passing in meeting ID for us to know whether this is an edit form or a create form. So now this is sort of where that thing looks like. It's got meeting ID. I can't even show you the return anymore. It started to grow with both the create and the edit and the submit function at the end of it. And then the form itself stays relatively the same at this stage. But hey, we've hit all the product requirements. Amazing. But again, this code is only half the complexity of what your real-world case is, which means by now, when you make these changes, you're probably having to take much longer time to read that code. And just when you think you're done, there's even more. Because as the business grows, product is going to want more shit, man. That's just how it goes. One example that could really throw a wrench in our component for here is in this list view. We want to make sure our accountants don't double book themselves. So on this particular list view, they want to make sure that the date and times where they already have meetings are disabled. So at this point, for that meeting form component, we have to pass in this date range thing and have it check whether the date and the time matches any of those, and if so, disable them. Whole lot of complexity. I'm going to save you all from looking at that code because it was a misery trying to write it, so I just gave up. We're hitting 3 common problems at this point with that dry code principle, following that blindly. We're hitting complexity, where the component complexity has increased so much, it's really hard to figure out what's happening in there. And with each new product requirement, it's just continuing to make that component worse. Debugging. If there's a bug in there, well, good luck to you. That's going to take a long time to fix. Because reading that code is really hard. And product locked. This is the one I think, as developers don't really think about, is by making that component the same, we've literally forced product and business decisions to be aligned around it. Each of the different product areas are now locked together. A change in one causes a change in another. This ultimately leads to developer frustration, where the productivity suffers. We slow down. We're not able to build as fast as we used to. And building anything new becomes increasingly not only hard, but risky, where you're going to introduce something unexpected to your code base. This is usually caused by conflating business logic and developer logic. Let's actually define those terms. So business logic focuses on the rules and workflows for a user specific to a particular business, versus developer logic is actually the implementation of that. It's the technical decisions and coding practices employed by developers to implement the business logic. They're not the same. And we always make that mistake a lot of times where we assume they're not. So let's dig into these 4 product areas. They're technically 4 different business workflows. The only real commonality they have is the fact that they all share a form. Like, they all have this final form element that the user is supposed to look at some point that's very similar. Visually, it's similar, but the underlying prospect of how the user gets there is very different. Let's step through that, right? For the user calendar, the user client list. We have from the calendar, the user clicks on the calendar with the day and time slot. The modal with the meeting form appears. User inputs blank fields, and then the meeting is booked on submit, and it appears on the calendar. For the client list, user clicks on the book meeting button for the specific client. The modal pops up with the meeting form where the client data is pre-filled for the user. The user inputs any blank fields and submits, and then the meeting is booked. Same final visual, but 3 out of 4 of those steps are different for each of them. Obviously, you're all thinking, of course, that's clear. We all saw the difference of that, right? But those slight differences is what's causing the complexity in your code now. So let's take it one step further and just look at client calendar here as well. So now there's the client side, added in the complexity that your current user is a completely different object too, right? So client on the calendar clicks day and time, modal with the meeting form appears, day and time is pre-filled. Client inputs blank fields, meeting is booked, and appears on the calendar. Client dashboard, client clicks on book meeting button, modal with the meeting form appears. Nothing is pre-filled. Client input blank fields and submits button, submits form, and number 4, meeting is booked and appears on the dashboard. Again, 3 out of 4 of those steps completely different when you actually just write them down. The business logic here is completely separate beast. And by making our book meeting form into one component, we've made business decisions for product. We've literally locked them up saying, for each of these unique business workflows, we're building one component, and all has to fit in this one component now. Just because the component looked alike, right? So we know the problem. What's the solution? This is going to seem a little dumb, but create a meeting form component for each area. Be verbose. Duplicate your code, and then add comments after, right? This sounds crazy, but it's as simple as that. If you started out by making a different meeting form component for each of those different views, instead of trying to use that same component, because the business logic there is different, we wouldn't be in a problem where now that component is so complex. We wouldn't have to be trying to slice and dice that component in order to make it fit all these different requirements, right? This may sound crazy because that's a lot of code to be duplicating, right? That's okay. I get that a lot. But you can get concise after. That's the best part. Because in the beginning, when you get those 4 requirements, it's really hard to actually sit there and look at it and say, you know what? Let me go ahead and optimize because I think this is all going to be the same. You don't know. As developers, we don't know. That's kind of the job of the product people a little bit. You should be in that discussion, but it's not your job to determine that. Your job is to implement that business logic, right? So you don't know what is actually going to be the same. Long term, this could even build out differently where they have separate fields for the accountants versus the clients. So it makes no sense right now to go ahead and make them into one component. So go ahead and make them into 4 components, because later, we can get concise after. As we're building those things out, we can go back, and it's much easier now to bring these 2 duplicate areas that are very similar into one component. And it's much easier for us to understand what is same versus what is not, right? So some clean ways of doing this is create smart parent components for those specific areas, feature areas, for each of those areas. Simple component that just renders the form. So one way to make the commonality is a form component that's super simple. It doesn't care about what the onSubmit function is. It doesn't care about what the initial data is. It'll accept some data, and it'll just spit out forms, like the fields, basically, right? And duplicate that simple component. So for example, in our case, the accountants versus the clients have slightly different visuals, right? There's one select that's different. We don't know how else that's going to change. Go ahead. There's no harm in making 2 separate meeting form components for those 2 use cases. And then, of course, document all of your components. So parent components specific for each area can look like something like this. We have one that says for the accountant calendar meetings, right? And it's doing all of the post call, the create and the edit. It can do all of the beautiful logic for fetching the data, formatting the data as it needs to, and even handling the logic for opening and closing the modal. And the meeting form itself, simple component, all it's worried about here is taking the client's information. We'll dig into what that meeting form looks like in the next few slides. Similarly, parent component specific for the client calendar, we have a client meeting form. The big difference here being the accountants, it doesn't give a shit about the clients, the list of clients. It cares about the list of accountants, and that's what it's got. Same thing, the post calls are specific to the client side. They're both separate things. They don't have to care about what happens in the one, doesn't matter to the other. Now, what the actual form component for the accountants can look, it doesn't have that conditional anymore. All it's actually doing is spitting out the form and including the accountant ID. It doesn't care about any conditional fields, because at that point, if you're starting to do conditional fields, it may be a good idea to separate them, right? Same thing for the client side. Instead of the accountants, you're going to have the clients being mapped over. So again, you're duplicating some code there, but you're keeping separation of concern, separation of the business logic. Sample of the docs. So at Healthy, we use Storybook. You can use something like Storybook if you like as well. Because we use TypeScript, Storybook is really cool about spitting out all the props for that component along with the docs. And it does it automatically, which is beautiful. Other additional bonuses of Storybook is you can add comments, which will show up as docs in your little view here, basically. So we actually go ahead and put our form, our dumb form component, as a component in Storybook with documentation on why we made it a separate component. And we may have like little sub-components for the same piece. So like how there's these nested elements, we would have like full, accountant form, full client form, and why they're different. And we'd have actual little snippets of docs, like 1 to 2 lines of words actually explaining why. Because again, you're writing code not just for the product, but also for your teammates to be able to read it and understand it 6 months down the line, when you may be on vacation and don't want them calling you. By doing the separation of concern, the big benefit is, as the product grows, the complexity of the code doesn't have to grow. And you are not boxed in now, having to make weird, bad tech debt choices to try to hit that product goal. And you're not fighting your product people. You get to work with them a little better. So now, this is where that whole concept from dry, verbosity, to concise code is better. Start out with duplication. Duplication is necessary. Add a lot of comments and docs. It's okay if you're being a bit wordy, if you can explain yourself better. And hey, fucking use ChatGPT to make it concise if you want to. Dry your code after a certain amount of duplication. So one of the rules that we try to use is if you're duplicating something 3 times or 4 times, more than twice, more than 3 times usually, let's look at making it dry, right? And at that point, let's actually break down the business logic there and see what pieces are actually common enough to be dry. If not, leave it alone. And that's that leads to, well, my little typo there. Be very careful, not very careful when you make dry code. You should be very careful not to make business decisions for the product. So that's my whole talk. Questions?